Good morning. Well, that was pretty weak. Good morning. Welcome to Christmas. We're going to be looking at some Christmas passages through the next few weeks, but it's great to be able to celebrate Christmas this time of the year. It's great, happy for some times and happy for some people, but some people are sad. They look back at things that they've in the past and just kind of it's a hard time for some of them. Actually, I want to bring an update. Some of you know Margaret Priestley. She's been staying with her daughter-in-law, doing pretty well over at in Yardley, and all of a sudden last week had a fall, and she's been in St. Mary's ICU, and doesn't look like she's going to make it at this point. So you might just be praying for her family. They're going through the point of, will she make it through the night kind of thing almost at this point. So just pray for Margaret. She knows the Lord. Her and her husband served here for many years, so it's just a great time to know that we have Jesus Christ in our lives, and it's an encouraging time for them. But a lot of times we look at our backgrounds and we think of Ancestry. I mean, Ancestry.com is a big thing. How many people have done the DNA thing with Ancestry.com? Anybody? Okay, one. I'm not sure. Some people say, I don't know if I want to do it because I'm not sure who's going to be in my background. Yeah, we've done some genealogy. Thank you, Mary. I was wondering I'm going to need that this morning. Thank you. We think of genealogies, and I have done a lot of our genealogy going back, trying to find out some things. We don't have a lot. I can't trace it really far back. It's interesting because when I have a couple aunts and uncles who have passed away, and we've collected all their stuff, but I haven't had a chance to go through it. And some of the stuff goes back a long ways. So we'll see what we have as far as ancestry going back and seeing who we have in our background and so forth. But a lot of people like to do that. Ours goes back to England and Wales, and I think Jamie's goal is to be able to go to Wales sometime and check out our ancestors. We do actually have some cousins still living up in England. And so Ancestry.com is a really big thing. Well, it was a big thing for the Jews also, because the Jews needed their ancestry in order to decide, are you Jewish or not? And just like today, it seems like if you have a certain percentage of, I've got some relatives who are married up in Washington, and they've married with Indians and so forth, and if you have a certain amount of Indian blood, you can get certain scholarships and certain advantages because you're Native American and so forth. The Jewish population has been tried to be wiped out so many times, and their genealogy is what helped them be able to keep their pedigree and to know who was in the background and so forth. And so when Jesus Christ was born, it was important who was in his background. What was his pedigree? Did he really deserve to be on the throne of David? And these kind of things were important to the disciples, and they did some history and some background checks into that stuff. And if you look at the four Gospels, actually 3 of them talk about the birth of Jesus. One of them rather in a different way, not the actual events, but the actual events of Christmas are written in both Matthew and in Luke. And in Matthew and Luke looked at things a little differently. Luke wanted to look at the person of Jesus Christ, and he was the Son of Man. And so when you look at his genealogy, and we're not going to look at that today, but when you look at the genealogy, it goes all the way back to Adam, because he wants to trace it through Mary's lineage all the way back to show that he was a son of man. And he goes all the way back to Adam and Eve themselves in the book of Luke. Matthew had a little different purpose. Matthew wanted to show Jesus Christ as king and show that he actually deserved the right to be king. Now, we all know that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin, and that meant that Joseph was not his real biological father in a sense, because the Holy Spirit was his biological father. But to all those in Israel, Joseph was his father. And so as they looked at Joseph as father, what was Joseph's lineage? Did Jesus Christ deserve the throne? Where was his lineage? And so Matthew winds up taking the lineage of Jesus Christ all the way back through the kings of Israel. So if you want to take a look with me at Matthew chapter 1 briefly, we're not going to go through the whole thing today, but we're going to look at a certain part of it. Oh, and before we get on to that, I have another piece of business I got to look at. I've got to bring this up. Go Army. We beat Navy, I think the third time in the year. I think our score is still like they won 42 times and we've won like 15, but go Army. We won. Okay? So we got to talk about that because it doesn't happen very often. So at any rate, go Army. And so let's tie that into the sermon because all the kings were leaders and commanders and chiefs of what? The army. So yeah, so we're on. So if you take a look at Matthew chapter 1, we're going to look at the genealogies here. And if you go back through, let's start backwards. Go back to verse 16. It says, "And Jacob was born to Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom was born Jesus, who was called Christ." Now notice, Matthew does not say that Joseph was his father. He says Joseph was what? The husband of Mary, okay? But that made him legitimate to the throne. That made him an heir to the throne in that way, a sense. So they trace him all the way back. And if you keep on going backwards there, you come to, it goes back from Jacob to Matan to Eleazar, and it goes all the way back. In verse 13, you see a name called Zerubbabel. And if you remember when we were talking about Israel coming back into the land of Israel from the 70-year captivity, Zerubbabel was one of the ones that was involved in that whole excursion. But then you go back and if you go back to verse 2, he goes all the way back to Abraham. To Abraham was born Isaac, to Isaac Jacob, and to Jacob Judah and his brothers. Why does he stop at Abraham? Yeah. Abraham was basically considered the first Jew. In fact, if you talk to the Muslims today, they will trace their lineage back to who? Abraham, okay? Abraham had 2 children, Isaac and Ishmael, okay? Actually, he had about 5 other children also, if you look at it. And most people don't realize that. They only think of Ishmael and Isaac. But later on, after Sarah died, he remarried and had a number of other children, okay? So there were ones that we weren't, but Isaac and Ishmael were the 2 main ones. If you look at the Islamic ancestry and what they claim that Ishmael was the promised son. And they flipped them, Isaac and Ishmael, to try to say Ishmael's line has gone through the Arabs, and so the Arabs are the ones that are, the predominant ones. This didn't happen till when, though? Anybody know when Muhammad was born? Or when he huh? Yeah, 622 was actually the year when I think he had the visions and so forth. So early 600s. So the idea around Islam did not even start to 600 AD. And so in writing back and going back, they're trying to change history that has already been taking place. But Isaac was the promised son. And so when Matthew is trying to show that Jesus Christ is an heir to the throne and traces it back, he goes back as far as Abraham because Abraham was the start of the Jewish race. God promised Abraham that he would have, descendants. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob had how many sons? 12 sons, okay? And so as you follow that through, you'll find that these are the sons that they follow through into who had the throne. Now, I'll give you one more fact before we move on to the main topic that I want to look at the genealogy. It says Levi became the priestly tribe, correct? They did not have an inheritance of land. Levi was replaced by 2 other tribes that were the children of one particular person. Who was that? Joseph. Joseph, remember, was the favorite son, and when Jacob was dying, he went into Joseph, and he gave each of Joseph's 2 children. He said, Joseph, you won't have a part, but each of your 2 children will have a part equal to my other children. And so technically speaking, at that point, there wound up being 13 tribes, okay? But the tribe of Levi was taken as the priestly tribe. And, I could go into all kinds of history. It's really fun and interesting for me to look at this and to see how all this took place. But this morning, we're going to restrict our look at what I call the women of Christmas past. And as you look at the Matthew chapter 1, there are 4 women, actually 5 if you count Mary, that show up in Jesus Christ's genealogy. Now, they did not trace genealogy through the women because who were the kings? The men, okay? So they wanted to try the kingly line came through the men. But in tracing this lineage, they picked out 4 women. Matthew did 4 women that were put into this genealogy as being important and as being ones that he wanted to include. Why he picked just those 4 or those specific 4, we don't know, except that the Holy Spirit wanted those 4 included in the scriptures. And today I'd like to look at them because it's an encouragement. So many times I hear people say, oh, my pedigree was so bad, and I grew up in a poor home, or I grew up in a particular ethnic community, or I grew up in a particular country, and we try to blame a lot of the stuff that we have on our backgrounds. And to be honest with you, a lot of times those things do follow us. If you follow Jonathan Edwards, for instance, you find that he was the president of Princeton, but you find a lot of his descendants wound up doing great things. But that's because the person has an impact on the children, and we impact our children. But just because we don't have the greatest of lineage doesn't mean that we're destined to not have greatness in our family and in our future. And so each one of these women that are picked out in Jesus Christ's lineage or Jesus Christ's ancestry became what? The ancestors of a king, and actually the ancestors of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And I believe that perhaps Matthew chose these 4 women so we would know that regardless of our background, regardless of our background or whatever took place in our lives, that we could have an impact and a positive impact. So as we look at these women, all these women obviously became mothers, and as we start out with this, I've got a few things that mothers, this is from an article, things that my mother taught me. See if you understand. My mother taught me about logic. If you fall off that swing and break your neck, you can't go to the store with me. My mother taught me about intuition. Put your sweater on. Don't you think that I know when you're cold? My mother taught me to meet a challenge. What were you thinking? Answer me when I talk to you, and don't talk back. How about humor? When the lawnmower cuts off your toes, don't come running to me. Here, if you don't eat your vegetables, you'll never grow up. Anybody hear that? I still don't eat my vegetables. I like my meat and potatoes. She told me about genetics. You're just like your father. She told me about my roots. Do you think you were born in a barn? How many heard that? Anybody heard that? Yeah, okay. So you relate to these, huh? How about wisdom? When you get wisdom about age, getting smarter as you get older. When you get to be my age, you understand. Okay? Anticipation. Just wait until your father gets home. And finally, justice. One day you'll have kids, and I hope they turn out just like you. Then you'll see what it's like. Okay, well, a lot of wisdom for mothers there. These 4 women we're going to look at weren't Mother Teresa in their background. And we're going to tell some stories, and I'll tell you the Bible is very truthful. It doesn't sugarcoat a bunch of stuff. It winds up laying it right out there where people are. And we're going to look at these 4 ladies today, and as we do, I want you to understand that they're not going to be the perfect women, and yet each of these women had a part in Jesus Christ, the Messiah, having the kingly line and being in his ancestry through Joseph. My theme this morning, and if you have your papers and want to write it down, I'll give you the theme up front, and then we'll kind of go through it. It's God's grace brings hope for those who come to God through Christ, the Christ child. God's grace brings hope for those who come to God through the Christ child. And today we're talking about God's grace in our lives. Let's look at the first person. That's Tamar. And I call that the childlessness to Messiah lineage. Childlessness to Messiah's lineage. Let me tell you about the story of her a little bit. It goes back to Genesis 38. If you want to read it for yourself, you can. If you want to read it while I'm talking, you can. But Genesis 38 tells the story of Tamar. And it goes back to Judah, who was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Okay, so he was one of the heads of the tribes. And Judah would eventually wind up being the promised tribe. I'm not going to go through exactly why, but the first two, Reuben and Simeon, were disqualified from being the ones who would carry the line and be the firstborn, have the birthright, because of some bad stuff they did in their background. So they lost the opportunity to be that, and it came down to Judah. So Judah's the third one in the line. Judah marries a woman named who was actually the daughter of Shua, and he has two children. Eventually, or actually three sons. Eventually, Shua dies. So Jacob goes out after she dies and the period of mourning's over. He goes out to see his sheep and his sheep herders, and to see how they're doing. Probably the sons are out there and whatever. And so he goes out and he goes to see how things are happening with them. But before that, he actually had he had married his oldest son to a woman named Tamar. And she's the woman that's in this line here. The oldest son was named but he was an evil man, and he died. So and Tamar are married. Dies. Tamar has no children. Well, I don't know if you remember back, there was a law of levirate marriage in Jewish culture, because the inheritance, actually the land and the bloodline, whether it's the kingship or whatever, ran through the oldest child or through that child. Well, that son just died, and so there was a levirate marriage that the wife of the first son would have a child with the second son, but that child would be named after the first son. That child would have the inheritance of the first son, not of the second son. So that means the second son who has the child with his brother's wife, who is deceased now, that child is going to have the name and carry on the inheritance of the first son, the deceased son, not the second son. So the second son in line, his name was Onan. And so she was going to have a baby with Onan, and that baby would then be Er's inheritance. As they were in the act of having sex, okay, he discontinued it straight in the middle so that she wouldn't get pregnant. I'm not going into the details, but you who are married know what I'm talking about, okay? So everything went fine. At the last second, he stopped it, and she didn't get pregnant. God was mad at him because he was supposed to allow her to have a child in the name of the older son. So God killed off him. So the second son died. Now you think, I'm the father, Judah. My first son died because he was a bad kid. My second one died because he didn't want to have a son in a line with the first kid. So what would she do then? She should marry the third child. He said, I'm not going to do that. I'm afraid the third son's going to die. I'm not going to have anybody. And so I don't know how old it was, but he gave the excuse to Tamar, just go back to your father's house, act like a widow, put you on the widow's garments, which you would identify as a widow, live in your father's house, and when my third son gets old enough, you can have a child with him, and that will be my child, my firstborn, who will then inherit everything. She goes off. He doesn't do anything about it. His wife dies. Shua was the father-in-law. His daughter dies, Judah's wife dies. He does this period of mourning, and now what do? Your wife of many years is gone. You got two sons that are gone. You got a third son. So he decides to go out to the sheep pasture and see how the herders are doing with all the sheep. He was a pretty rich guy, went out there. And in those days, they had what they called temple prostitutes. And I still don't understand this, but this is pretty much of a pagan culture. I don't know how you have a prostitute associated with a temple of God, but not the true God of the foreign gods, but that's what they had. And so he goes out to the sheep herders, and Tamar says, I'm never going to get to marry his son. He just has me here like this. He's never going to do anything about it. So she dressed up as a temple prostitute. when she heard he was going out to the things. He had just lost his wife. He was lonely and everything else. She dresses as a temple prostitute. Judah goes by and says, here's an opportunity. I'm going to have some fun. He engages the temple prostitute, who happens to be, without his knowledge, Tamar, his daughter-in-law, and she winds up getting pregnant. She goes on. He said, when they first meet, he says, well, what do you want for payment? And he says, I'll give you a kid, a small billy goat. That'll be your payment. So that's fine. But he said, how are you going to send it to me? I want something else as security. We know what security is, right? Until I get payment. And so, many people hold security until they get payment. The bank holds your house until they get payment. And then eventually they take it back if you don't pay them. So she wants security. She gave him his ID. So he gave her his cord and his ID. Basically, his cord and staff, which were his ID. And said, hold this until I get back. So then he sends one of his friends back with the kid to Tamar. But was she really a temple prostitute? No. She had gone back to her father's house, put on her regular garbs, and the guy went all over the place and couldn't find her. And so Judah says, we're going to become a laughingstock if we keep this up. Just forget it. I sent the kid. I did what I was supposed to do. We're done. He goes on his merry way. 3 months later, what does he find out? Tamar's pregnant. And so he gets all in a huff. And he says, you were supposed to wait for my third son to get married. How come you broke the vows that you had had of marriage to my third son and went out and got pregnant with someone else? And so the law said that they would be burned. So he says, take her out to the stake and burn her. Tamar, they gather her, they start walking her out, and she says, by the way, the guy that got me pregnant, this is his ID. And she gives the cord and the staff to the guys that are doing it. She says, ask Judah if he recognizes this stuff. They take it to Judah, and he says, guess what? I'm the guy. He said, he stops the execution. Stop everything. Hold on. Bring her to me. And if Bible doesn't tell us they became husband and wife, it does tell us that he never had sex with her again. But she was pregnant. And she had twins. And the twins were named Perez, and let me take a look at my notes so I get the second one. Perez is really kind of the important one we're going to find in this particular text. But it's Perez and Zerah. And I don't know why all these details are included in Genesis, but they are. The twins are about to be born. Zerah, his hand comes out first. And the nursemaid ties a scarlet cord on his hand. But he doesn't get born. He pulls his hand back in, and the other child gets born first, Perez. And then Zerah gets born. Now, the first one to stick out his hand was Sarah. But the first person to get born was Perez. So Perez had the birthright. And it was an interesting, I don't know why that interesting story is there, but except that God chose Perez over Sarah to have the birthright. He's born. And when you look in Matthew chapter 1, it says, and to Judah were born Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Doesn't give any of the history there. And to Perez was born Hezron. And he just keeps on going right down the list. Perez wound up in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know what you think about all that. Pretty interesting story. Maybe you see young people that say the Bible's boring. Maybe we'll go down and read some of it, I like Joshua and Judges, and boy, I'll tell you, there's some really gross and some very neat stories in there. And, I was a PK all my life, 33 years. My dad was a pastor at a church, and I listened to every single sermon he'd had. I was there every single Sunday. So you think, I get bored a little bit. Well, you imagine me, every once in a while, I'd say, it doesn't relate to me. So what would I do? Well, I couldn't be, scribbling or doing anything else different. So I'd open my Bible, and I'd read Joshua and Judges. I love those books, and I learned a lot about those things. There's lots of interesting stories in those books. And this is the story that we have from her. So let me go back to this and just put this in a sentence. we have law-breaking and immoral behavior. Law-breaking, they didn't follow the law that was given for the levirate marriage. Immoral behavior, out the wazoo. I mean, if this happened today, that's worse than a soap opera, I haven't even seen that on the soap operas today. This kind of a thing take place, and yet Tamar and Perez are ancestors of the Messiah. Isn't that incredible? This person was accepted by God into the lineage of Jesus Christ. I have a lesson for each one of these 4 women we're going to look at. And my lesson for this one is, if you want to write it down there, don't ever think your life is beyond redemption. Don't ever think your life is beyond redemption. Widowed twice, acting as a prostitute to trap your father-in-law into doing what he should have arranged somehow. A long period of time, not just a couple of days, grappling with this. And yet her life was redeemed in the sense that her son wound up in Jesus Christ's lineage. 2 Peter 3:9, one of my favorite verses. I've got a lot of them, but a verse I think is really important. It's the verse that verse 8 talks about 1,000 years with God is like one day, and one day for 1,000 years. If you think God's taken a long time, realize he lives outside of time. So we say, oh, that's taking God a long time. Well, it's just an instant in his mind. But those couple of verses end like this. It says, "For the Lord is patient towards you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance." God is a patient God. Regardless of what's going on in your life, what kind of a background you have, or what's in the past, there is always the possibility of redemption. Keep that in mind. No matter how bad things go, maybe you're a widow like she was. Maybe you've had some immorality in your background. Maybe you've had some childless. Who knows what's in your background? But God has a place for you. And too many times we give up on God because we lose our patience. And we say, I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit church. I'm going to quit doing this. I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to quit trying. And suicide rates and depression are up through the roof because people quit trying. But if we continue to persevere, there's redemption for us. There's a way forward. Keep going. The second person I want to take a look at is found in the next verse. We're actually down in verse 5. If you start looking through there, maybe it's not 5. Yeah, it's verse 5. "And to Salmon was born Boaz by Rahab." And you know who Rahab was? You remember her? She's the prostitute living in Jericho. This sermon keeps on getting juicier and juicier, doesn't it? The prostitute living in Jericho. Forgiveness. Do you remember the story that took place there? Israel's on the west bank, okay? Actually, on the east bank at this point. They want to cross over to the west bank. And so Joshua takes 2 guys, and I don't know why he does this. He must have really trusted these guys, because the last time they sent spies to check out Israel, 12 spies went, 10 brought a bad report. Joshua and Caleb brought a good report, and nobody listened to them. So this time, he only sends out 2 spies. These guys must have been pretty trustworthy. They go across the river before Israel goes across to check out the land and see what's there. Joshua's the commander. He doesn't want to know what I'm up against. And so they go to the first town that was there, this large city of Jericho. Walled city. And they go inside. And they walk around it. But someone says that they're there. Somehow the king finds out. And I don't know how they wound up in her house, but they go to Rahab's house, and she takes them in. Now, she's a prostitute. How obvious is it going to be, or odd is it going to be, looking for 2 single men to walk into Rahab's house? No. We don't care. There are men walking in and out of that house all day long, Never took a second thought. But someone found out and tipped off the king that they were there. And they still go to Rahab. They go to Rahab's house and said, "We understand that there's 2 spies from Israel that entered into your house." I said, "Oh yeah, they came." But they left. You better hurry up. Maybe you can catch them before they go back. And so they sent out a spy team to find these two spies. This is by the way, in Joshua chapter 2, if you want to read the story. They sent out a spy team, and as soon as the spies get out the gate, as soon as the search party gets out of the gate, they lock the gates. How come? If they're still there, they want to keep them there. They go out looking for these guys. Now, where were the two spies? Anybody remember? They were on the roof. Rahab had covered them with some flax and put them on the roof. And she lied to these guys and said, they're not here. They already left. So the guys ran out. She has the spy, the guy's there. She says, now she's got people on the outside looking for them, and nobody on the inside wants them. So she says to the guys, she said, look, I protected you here. I want something in return. I want you to guarantee me that when you come, that you will not kill me and my family, my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, all my relatives. I want protection. And so the spies make her a deal. There are two aspects, two promises, two criteria for her not to be killed and her family. The first criteria is she can't tell anybody what she did. Or she can't go and say, oh, I changed my mind, I'm going to tell them all that the spies were here. She doesn't do that. You can't do that for one. Secondly, here's a scarlet thread. Tie this around your window. And when we see the scarlet thread, we'll know that you live there. And everybody else will also. And your family will be protected. Now, I wish I had an answer for this, and I don't. Some of you Bible scholars who want to check this out, but I think it's kind of interesting that in the first two women's stories, we got scarlet threads. The first scarlet thread was wrapped around Zerah's hand. He pulled it back. The second scarlet thread was wrapped around the window when the guys left. I thought that was interesting. I can't tell you why. I looked, I thought maybe there's going to be a scarlet thread in the third and fourth women's too, but I couldn't find any. Interesting story. But so how did the spies going to get out? Well, she lived on the wall. She let them down through a rope in the window. These guys were spies, they were athletic. They went down through a rope from her window out to the outside, so they got through the lock gates. And she said, go to the hill country, hide there for 3 days. Once the search team can't find you, they come back, then you can go back. And they went back and they told Joshua what had taken place. And so consequently, they wound up coming, and you remember they marched around Jericho how many times? Actually not. Total, how many times did they march around Jericho? Huh? 9? They ravaged around 7 times when? Who said 13? Stand up. Give her a hand. How many times did they go around the last time? 7 times. But they also marched around once for each of the 6 prior days. So they marched around once for 6 days in a row, and then the 7th day they marched 7 times, 13 times. Walls fell down flat, and I'm not sure if that one section, maybe that one section of wall stayed standing where Rahab was, but her and her family were saved. And we find out later that this is where she winds up being in the lesson. And I want to read you just a few 2 verses from from Joshua. This is what she said to the spies when she was trying to make this bargain, and why she left them stay there. It says this, chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord, your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. She had accepted the Jewish Messiah, Jewish God, as being the God of the heavens. And consequently, she made this deal. My lesson for you this morning from her is this. Previous sinful lifestyles can be changed for God's glory. Previous sinful lifestyles can be changed for God's glory. Here was a woman who had made her living as a prostitute. And actually, and I don't know how to even figure this out, lied to the king saying the guys weren't here. And yet she winds up getting married to Boaz. and having a child. I don't know the details. But my corollary is this to that, and it's not in your notes. It's this. You can't come to God and stay in your sinful lifestyle. Don't think, when I come to God, if I'm, a prostitute or immoral or have some other background, something that really I know is wrong, when you come to God, don't think you can keep that. Because God expects us to live the way He wants us to live. But you can overcome that lifestyle. So many people today think, oh, I can come. I mean, there's an alternate lifestyle, and the immorality is okay, and living together is fine, and I can become a Christian and keep these things, but you can't. You can't. But God can change you. And even though as a Christian, and we have a lot of these different sins that people are trying to stay acceptable. We have young people today that think you can live together and without being married, and that's fine. And that's not fine by God. If we violate God's commands, we can expect that problems are going to be in our lives someplace. And certainly when we come to meet God in the final day of judgment, there will be answers to pay for. We will have to give an account of what we do. So while God will accept anyone, recognize that it says, if any man is in Christ, he's a new creature. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And so as you become new, you will change your lifestyle, and God will help you do that. But anybody can come to Him. Anybody can walk through that door. It doesn't matter their lifestyle, doesn't matter their race, doesn't matter their social income. God will accept anyone, and He will allow us to change for His glory. Never give up. Come to Jesus for cleansing and restoration. Third person, Ruth. Ostracization to love. The book of Ruth is the whole idea here, is the whole description of her life. There are 4 chapters. You can read an interesting love story. If you look at Ruth, you find out that she was a Moabitess. Now, there was a law in Deuteronomy 23, 3 through 6. If you want to write that passage down and look it up, 23, 3 to 6 of Deuteronomy. And it said that because the Moabites and Ammonites had not helped Israel when they were on their way into the land, that God would wind up, that none of them could come into Israel's, relationship with Israel, even up to 10 generations. So everybody in Moab and Ammon were ostracized from ever becoming a part of Israel. Ruth was a Moabitess. How'd she get into Christ's lineage? I mean, an obvious exhibit of God's grace. The story winds up that, and this is really incredible, because so many Christians, yourself even, can think of, we think of this, we do this. Elimelech and Naomi lived in Bethlehem. We know where Bethlehem is, right? Christmas story? They lived in Bethlehem. Do you know what Bethlehem means? Anybody? House of bread. House, Lehem, bread. Bethlehem, house of bread. But there was a famine. How odd. There was a famine in the house of bread because Israel had not done what they were supposed to do. Elimelech and Naomi lasted for a while, and instead of staying in Bethlehem, they decided to go to where? Moab. The place that God said nobody will ever come into Israel from there. They went there. They had 2 sons. What did the 2 sons do? Got married. They married Moabite women. As time goes on, and I'm not sure this is necessarily judgment for them, but it's what took place, and they were certainly out of God's will going to Moab instead of staying in Bethlehem, regardless of what the circumstances was. Elimelech dies. Naomi winds up being a widow. But beyond that, both of her sons died also. Now, who do we have in Moab? We've got Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. 3 widows. 2 young Moabite girls, and 1 old Israeli woman. She says, it can't get any worse than this. I'm going back to Bethlehem. One of the widows says, you guys stay here. You're Moabites, Stay here with your people. Get married. You're remarried. You're young girls. Get remarried. Raise a family. Orpha says, Ruth says, I will not stay. And she has these beautiful words that are often quoted if you look at it in the scriptures. It says, where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. She was totally 100% dedicated to her mother-in-law. Now, right there's a lesson, huh? We all these mother-in-law jokes and how difficult mother-in-law. She says, even though my husband is dead, I am committed to you as my mother-in-law. I will stay with you. She goes back to Israel with Naomi. There's another law. Well, there's the law we've dealt with already, and this is a second repeat of this, of levirate marriage. When someone dies, the firstborn, the widow marries who? Another brother, right? In order to raise up the children. Now, there's two things that come with this. If you marry the widow, you get two things. Your son becomes the firstborn in the inheritance line, but you also get to inherit all the property of that person. And so you inherit the property also. Ruth comes back with Naomi, and they need some food. Ruth is an industrial. She's not a lazy girl. She says, I'm going to go glean wheat. And Naomi says, hey, here's a guy that is a distant relative of ours. Go glean in his fields. You'll be a little bit more safe there. She goes to glean in his fields. He sees her. He says, who is she? He says, well, that's a daughter, of a daughter-in-law of Naomi. He says, she's really here, Boaz said. God bless her for doing that. And he saw her and he said, stay in this field. And it's interesting. Why does he say? Because if you go to someplace else, you might get hurt. Even in Israel, attacks on women were possible. He says, stay here. I know you will be protected. So she stayed with his that whole season. And he wound up giving her extra. The love story continues, and eventually Boaz respects her and falls in love with her and says, I want to marry her. But the law of levirate marriage says that the person, and in this case, both the sons were dead, it's got to be some near relative. And Boaz says, there's a nearer relative to you than me. Let me go negotiate a deal with him to see if he wants to marry you, because technically he's got to say no first. And so he goes to the gate and he says, okay, Naomi's come back and she wants to get rid of her land, and find who's going to buy it. Do you want her land? And the guy says, oh, yeah, absolutely, man. I'll take that and the property. He says, okay, well, that's fine. He says, by the way, her son's widow is here, and so you have to marry the widow also. Oh, he says, I'm already married. That would be a deal breaker at home. I don't think I could do that. He says, if you want to marry you go ahead and do that. And so Boaz, second in line, winds up marrying Ruth and inheriting all of the land that Elimelech and Naomi would have had before that. What he is called, and what this law of levirate marriage is called, is kinsman redeemer. A kinsman, someone who's related, redeems the land and the widow's honor by providing a son and taking on the inheritance. Boaz became the kinsman redeemer and is an example to us of what Jesus Christ has done for us. We are like Ruth and Naomi, the widowed spouse, no resources, no ability to care for ourselves. And Jesus Christ comes along and pays the price and says, I will redeem you. And he becomes our kinsman redeemer. And so Ruth is an example of what it means to become a kinsman redeemer in this particular place. And the lesson that I have for us in this one is, even, and perhaps this relates to someone, even losing a loved one in death and having a bleak future can be redeemed and blessed by God. Even losing a loved one in death, and I'm thinking of even Margaret Priestley as she hangs on the balances between here and glory at this point in time. Even losing a loved one in death and having a bleak future can be redeemed and blessed by God. there's a future. This woman who thought she's a Moabite, she could never come into Israel's company. Her spouse is dead. All she has is an old mother-in-law, and yet she was redeemed and winds up being in Christ's lineage. There's one more. Bathsheba. Bathsheba. It says, and I find this interesting, in verses 6 and 7, it says, in Matthew chapter 1, in this genealogy, it says this, and to Jesse was born David the king, and to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. And to Solomon, it doesn't even mention Bathsheba's name. He says that she used to be the spouse or the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, I don't know if you know the story of this one here, but basically, to today's popular terminology, you could call Bathsheba a war widow. She was a war widow. She went from being sorrowful to being queen mother. Now, why do you say she's a war widow? Let me tell you briefly the story, and this one will be briefer than the others. Bathsheba and King David came to the time, they went to battle at certain seasons of the year back then. They didn't have all the technology we have now, and so some seasons you just couldn't fight in. I mean, the weather was just too bad. It was just too excruciating. So they would pick different seasons and say, okay, this is the time for this battle. I'm going to go out and battle this guy. So it came for the season for battle, and David, who usually spent some time with his troops, what usually went out with them, as he got older, and I think that was even later than this, they said, stay at home, David, you're going to get killed someday, and we need you as king. But he would normally go out with them. He stayed at home. He goes to sleep one night. He's in the palace, gets up, can't stay to sleep, goes out to the roof and starts walking around. Here's late at night. He looks out over the city, and I don't know how late it was, but on the rooftop, within eyesight of the palace, of course he's higher than everything up, you'd think this is a complete privacy thing, I'm on the top of my roof, but, there's walls and nobody else is going to be able to see me. The king was able to see, and he looked down and found this beautiful, gorgeous, knockout woman taking a bath. And he said, man, that is someone that I'd love to have sex with. He calls her to the palace and winds up doing what he wanted to do. Sends her back home. A few days later, she sends a note to him. Somehow communicate with him. I'm pregnant. Well, this is the worst nightmare for David. He thought he was going to have a night of fun and that was going to be over, maybe, or whatever. I don't know what he was thinking. So he says, well, now what I'm going to do. Her husband happens to be in the military, and he's out fighting with Joab. So he says, I'm going to bring him home. So he brings Joab, says, I need a report, Joab. Send Uriah home to give me a report. So Uriah comes home, gives him the report, and David says, thanks for the report. Go ahead home, enjoy yourself with your wife and so forth. I'll send you back tomorrow. Thinking that would cover everything up because they would have suspected that he was the father, because it was rather early in the pregnancy. Uriah is a military guy, though, and some of us in the military know that you serve the military, and it's a different culture. You just can't understand it. And Uriah says, my men are out on the field. I'm not going home. While they're out on the field, I will not do that. And he sleeps with the servants at the palace that night. David gets told to David, says, now what am I going to do? The guy's here. It's not. So the next day he says, Uriah, come on over to the palace. I want you to have a thing, have a meal with me. Gets him drunk, out of his mind. Uriah's drunk. Drinking what military soldiers do sometimes, unfortunately. How many times have we had to talk to people that are drunk, or had to bail them out or do something to help them along? Totally drunk. Says, okay, go ahead home to your wife. I'll send you back tomorrow. Guess what? The drunken soldier will not go back to his wife. Even totally drunk, he says, I'm going to stick with my guys. I'm staying right here at the palace. If they don't get R&R to go home, I'm not getting R&R to go home. So finally, David writes a note, sends it back to the commander, says, okay, fine, go back. Thank you very much for the Uriah, appreciate it. He sends it back with a note for Joab. What does the note say? Of course, he knows he can totally trust Uriah. When you're sent with a message with the military, you don't look at it to see what it is. You take it and give it to the commander. He did that. The note said, Joab, guys happen to get killed in war. it just kind of happens. It's too bad. Uriah's a great soldier. I want to put him at the front line, someplace where it's really heavy because he's a terrific guy. But then pull back a little bit. And if he gets killed, that'll be good. He does that. Uriah dies in battle. Joab sends a guy home with a message, says, hey, we were fighting this place, but it got really severe, and we lost a couple of men, and one of them was Uriah the Hittite. They send Uriah's home back. His wife mourns for him, and then eventually she winds up, after the mourning time's over, buries her husband. David calls her to the palace, and now she's going to have a baby. And he takes her as a wife. Now, for you ladies who think that's a very romantic story, by the way, this is David's 7th wife, just so you know, okay? He already had 6 for the first 7.5 years he was out. This is his 7th wife. I don't know where the other 6 were. One he didn't see very much. She was Saul's wife. But at any rate, so she comes and lives in the palace with him. Later on, he has children with all these other women also, at least one son by each one. Later on, there's a big battle for who's going to be king. And when he's about to die, and Bathsheba is counseled by David's advisors to do certain things. She does, and so forth. And David had recognized Solomon would be the next king, and so finally he becomes king. Solomon, by the way, was not the result of that first immoral intercourse. That child died within 10 days, and David was heartbroken. He cried, he prayed, but in 10 days the child died. And then he got up and he was fine after that. And people said, why are you fine? The baby's dead. Would think you'd be worse now. He said, well, while the baby was still alive, I thought maybe I could change God's mind, in essence. But now that he's gone, I know that he'll never come back to me, but I will go to him. And that's the way he looked at it. And many places we keep that as, that's one of the verses we use, one of the passages we use to say that, children who die will go to heaven, because David said, that child will not come back to me, but I will go to him. Some say that just means he's going to die like him. Others think that David truly believed that he would see that child in the afterlife. And so the child will be in heaven. Bathsheba winds up being from the unfortunate, was it a rape? I don't know. Could be even considered that. It was certainly being taken advantage by a king. She goes from that to being the queen mother of Solomon, one of the greatest kings of Israel, who built the temple, but later defected and was worse than in the beginning. Lost part of the kingdom. Lesson: earthly tragedy does not need to determine one's future. Earthly tragedy, and she went through a bunch of it. She lost that first child. She wound up being pregnant. She lost her husband, all that stuff. Earthly tragedy does not need to determine one's future. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. In case you missed it, the next slide will give you all 4 lessons for the 4. I hope you've written them all down: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Last year, I buried 2 young ladies. One was in her early 20s and one in her early 30s. Both moms. Both had young children. One was less than a year, and one was, I think, 4 or 5 years old. Overdoses. Wrong decisions. Their lives weren't great. One of them had actually come to our church and been involved for a little bit in some of the youth functions, but decided not to stay that way. Regardless of how old we get, regardless of where we are, life is a matter of choices. Do we want to follow God, or do we want to do what we want to do? Each of these 4 ladies had tragic backgrounds, but God's grace won out in their lives, and he can win out in your life too, and that of your friends. Our theme this morning is God's grace brings hope for those who come to God through the Christ child of Christmas. Jesus Christ can change our lives. If you're here discouraged, if you get depressed, if you get to the point where you think, my background is too bad to be used for God, you're full of a bunch of baloney, because God can use you. In fact, he can sometimes use you more after tragedy and with those problems than he can beforehand. Dear Lord, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you for the story of grace in these four ladies' lives. We ask that for those that might be discouraged here or might know Penn's family, nieces, nephews, kids that are on the wrong path, that they might continue to pray and recognize that you can transform lives. And none of us can ever dig ourselves so deep into sin and tragedy that you can't pull us out if we're willing to have that happen. In Jesus' name, amen.